A lot has happened in the last 3 years, hasn't it?
Amen.
In so many ways. And we've gone through a period of time in our country, and I think we're still seeing the ramifications of changing attitudes in government toward things religious. And America's not the only country that's going through this upheaval. It's around the world. So I'm going to share with you tonight some things old, some things new. I'm going to tell you some things that you're already aware of. I'm going to try to bring you up to date on where we are in our getting funds into India, to the school. The funds that you send to our work are used exclusively for the Kakinada School of Preaching. But like so many other countries, there's been an upheaval in schedules. The school had to close down for a period of time because of the COVID. And then after the COVID restrictions were lifted, many of their students had gone home. And so we were in the process of trying to make arrangements for them to come back to school. And unfortunately then, the Prime Minister of India declared war on Christianity. Now 3 years ago, Narendra Modi is his name. He vowed to the Hindus in his country that he would eradicate Christianity. And so he went about doing this not in a constitutional way, because the Constitution in India guaranteed freedom of religion. So in a roundabout way, he made laws that would prohibit funds coming into the country from foreign countries that were used for church-related, Christian-related activities. Well, one of the greatest impacts was upon the Mother Teresa Foundation. That's a Christian organization, and they receive into India literally billions of dollars a year. And all of a sudden, they could not get funds into India for the Mother Teresa Foundation. And so orphans were being dumped on the street. Well, they had to backtrack a little bit, and so they began making laws that would allow institutions to fill out registration forms, send them to the government in New Delhi, only in New Delhi. And those papers would then be processed, and once they were processed, then funds could be sent in for Christian organizations that were approved. Well, the Kakinada School of Preaching was caught right in the middle of that. And so about not this last February, but February of 2021, we began seeing a disruption in getting our funds into India. We managed to get a little in here and a little bit there. And then toward the end of the year, that restriction was temporarily lifted. And so we sent all the funds that had backlogged in 2021. We managed to get all those into India before the year ended. And so we started 2022 afresh, faced the same problem. And Brother Nehemiah had to go through the registration process. But you've only got 60 days to process the papers. And if they're not processed in 60 days, then you have to start all over again. Well, unfortunately, the government in New Delhi was swamped with applications, more than 10 million applications in the one office in India. And so the feet were dragging, the government officials were doing their best to stall, the time ran out, Nehemiah had to do it again. That's when I filled out my last report and informed our supporters that we're not able to get funds into the Kakinada School of Preaching. And so we had a backlog of about $40,000 to send to the school. And so the 1st of May, I started sending funds to Nehemiah's private account, and he hired a lawyer in order to make sure that all the funds that were coming into his private account were verified as non-personal income. Otherwise, you would put Brother Goodham in a high class of income, and those funds that were going in would be taxed something like 40 to 50%, and that simply would not work. I managed in May, June, and July to send an additional $10,000 to the school. We're within about $20,000 or $30,000 catching up to the funds that should be in the school now, and so things are looking a little bit better. And Nehemiah informed me a couple of days ago that they're now working on the paperwork. They think they're going to finish it this time before the expiration date comes, and that'll be the middle to late August. And so I'm praying, and I ask you to keep praying as well, that we'll see this problem resolved and we'll be able to send the funds straight to the Kakinada School of Preaching. I gave the option in my last report that I sent to you that we can do one of three things. That congregations who contribute to the Kakinada School of Preaching could just stay with us and let us collect the funds until we can send them into India. We could divert those funds temporarily to some other works. And there's a great opportunity coming open in Poland to teach refugees coming out of Ukraine and who are looking for things of a spiritual nature. And so there's some great efforts underway right now to sort of divert our attention in that direction. I don't think we're going to do that now because they're getting an extreme amount of response to that. Some great brethren are going into Poland, and it looks like the door is going to start opening up so that I can get the funds to Nehemiah. So right now we're sort of on hold, sending funds to his private account, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about our work in India. Some of this is going to be basically information that you're aware of, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my situation, where I am since the last time I visited with you. I started my work in India in 2004, and so you can do the calculation. I've been at this approximately 16, 17 years, almost 20 years now. And primarily my work has been with the Kakinada School of Preaching. That's the work that I introduced to you when I first came here, about 7, 8 years ago, I think. So you've been with me for about 8 years, and I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate that. We're also continuing to do work with orphans, and the funds that we send to orphans in India have not been disrupted in the least, because I can send them straight to Nehemiah, and I can tell him that this is for benevolent work. The last time that I was with you, we had 2 orphan homes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, where we are in their organization and their capacity, and also about a 3rd orphan home that we've now established. And so the opportunities continue to increase in the care for orphans. We still continue to work with preachers on location, and so we're being blessed with great work that's continuing in India. Now, my work now is not limited to India. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the change in my history and where I am. You've seen pictures of India. This is a typical picture of a train station in India. It's a crowded country. Every city is crowded, overpopulated, and yet the population continues to increase. Every city could be identified with words like squalor, filth, poverty. It's just an incredible society that has no hygiene whatsoever to it. When the COVID hit Kakinada, the city where the school is at, and the villages round about, they were having hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths a day. Now, you might say, well, if we had 1,000 deaths in Longview, that would be quite incredible. But you got to remember that India has a population of more than 1.5 billion. And so when you talk about 1 million people who have died from COVID in India, that's just a small fraction of their population. Barely makes a dent in the population of India. So let me tell you a little bit about the population figures. And when I go through the population figures, what I want you to see here and what I want you to think is souls, not just population. I want you to think souls with me. The population figures from 2004 to 2022. This is the time that I have been working in India. In 2004, the population in India was 1,130,127,000 and several hundred. In 2010, that's 6 years later, the population had risen to 1,234,414,000 plus a few hundred. In the year 2022, which is where we are right now, if I can get the slide to go forward, as of yesterday, I went online and got the clock meter, the population clock meter. And every 5 seconds, just like this, about every 2 seconds, a new population was increasing in India. As of yesterday at 9 o'clock, yesterday evening at 9 o'clock, the population was 1,408,395,209. And of course, it exceeds that. Now, let me try to put this in perspective with regard to the population. In 18 years that I've been working in India, there's been a net increase of 278,268,209. Now, just meditate on that figure for a moment. I think the population in America is something like 330 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. In other words, in that 18 years, the population in India has increased as much as the entire population in the United States of America. Are you beginning to get the impression of how many souls are entering this world, the largest percentage of whom will never hear the gospel, and never have the opportunity to obey the gospel. Each year, there is a net increase of 15,617,336. That means every day there's 42,788 souls born into India, the nation of India. Brethren, that's just India. That doesn't count other nations. China has the largest population in the world. I think now that China stands at something like 2.1 billion. And I would guess that probably China is seeing the same kind of increase that you're seeing in India. In fact, the population worldwide continues to increase at a dramatic pace. Some of you, as I look into your eyes, you're old enough to remember when we were concerned how in the world we were going to feed 4 billion people upon the face of this earth. We are rapidly now approaching 8 billion people upon the face of this earth. Now, let me sort of put all of this in perspective from the standpoint of our work as members of the Lord's church. As you look at this graph, this is a graph of India. These figures were taken about 5 years ago. 1,403,125,000. And I've brought that up to date now. And here's my point. If you look at this graph is increasing at a rapid pace. We have more people, catch this, brethren, we have more people living upon the face of the earth right now, in the last 10 years, more people living upon the face of this earth than have lived in the history of mankind from the beginning of time. We have the opportunity, you, me, the Lord's church, we have the opportunity to provide the greatest inhabitants of heaven than any generation. If we can reach the people, and no doubt when the population was increasing at such a rapid pace, we were scratching our heads and asking, how are we going to get the gospel to 4, 5, 6 billion people? And along comes the internet, the World Wide Web of information. Every Indian citizen, almost every Indian citizen, even on the eastern seaboard where they live in poverty, they have access to what we call, well, I don't have mine with me, a cell phone. The government provides cell phones. They can get on the cell phone and they can look up Bible study information. We have the capability of reaching people in India with the gospel, even out in the remote villages. I want to tell you one story from the last trip that I made to India. I haven't been there now in 6 years for varying reasons, one of which was, of course, I had to care for my wife as she was aging, and then she finally passed away. So it's been 6 years now since I've been to India. But I want to tell you a story that unfolded the last trip that I was there. I flew into Rajamundry and Nehemiah Goodham picked me up. I was suffering the ill effects of jet lag. I don't know how many of you have ever been through jet lag. I could barely stay awake. We stopped at 3 villages on our way to Kakinada, and when he dropped me off at the hotel, I had visions of going to bed and laying my head on the pillow and getting a good night's sleep, and he said, I'll pick you up in 2 hours. We've got a meeting 2 hours away in a village that he did not even know existed. And somebody in that village had an internet, had a cell phone, and came across an item that advertised the Church of Christ in Kakinada, contacted Brother Goodham and said, we want you to come to our village. We went out there. This little group was the only group that represented Christianity in that whole village. We taught the men, we baptized the preacher, we baptized about 80% of their congregation, and now in that little remote village, the Church of Christ is the only religious institution in that entire village. That's a sampling of what's unfolding in India. And as the population increases, God's giving us the opportunity then to take the gospel to those that are lost. Well, if we're going to take the gospel to people who are lost in India, we've got to prepare men. And the best way to prepare men is to prepare them in their own country. I've had the opportunity for the last 5 years to teach at the Memphis School of Preaching. I resigned that work on June the 20th, and I made my move to Montgomery, Alabama. I'll tell you more about that and why I made that move in a little bit. The Memphis School of Preaching is open to foreign students coming. But one of the greatest challenges in those 5 years that I faced as Dean of Administrations was to determine what people coming from foreign countries were coming because they wanted to preach and be trained, or because they wanted a door to come into America and stay here. And out of the foreign students that we brought into this country, 3 of those students who had signed a form said they would go back and preach the gospel in their native country upon graduation. 3 of those foreign students, 2 of them stayed in America against the pledge they had made. And so that you sort of get burned on things like that. And they just simply are here to try to, in many instances, to try to get a foothold in America. So the greatest, by far, the greatest way to evangelize other countries and to train men to preach the gospel is in their country, in their native language, where we can teach them, and even at a much less expense. And that is where the Kakinada School of Preaching comes in. The School of Preaching was started in 1971. I've told you a lot of this, so I'm going to sort of go through this very rapidly. First graduating class was in 1973. I've told you about Brother Goodham. Brother Joshua Goodham and Nehemiah Goodham were some of the first converts of J.C. Bailey. And Nehemiah and Joshua both had done an amazing job of evangelizing the eastern seaboard of India. And Brother Nehemiah Goodham has worked particularly with the Kakinada School of Preaching. They've graduated more than 4,500 students out of the school. Large percentage of those are still preaching. I have no way of knowing, and he has no way of knowing exactly what the number is. But I can tell you by what I've seen in Andhra Pradesh and the state up and down that eastern seaboard, they've been working diligently. You can drive through East Texas, and as you pass through little communities like Gilmer or Big Sandy, or you pass through Gladewater, or even larger cities, you will see signs that say Church of Christ 1 block this way. Some are right on the main highway. Almost every little town in eastern Texas has a Church of Christ in that town or close by. That's the way it is in Andhra Pradesh now. Every city we pass through when I'm there, Nehemiah says, there's a congregation down the road. There's one over in the next village. That's the work they've been doing as they graduate from this school. These are pictures of the school. You're familiar with the complex. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, in all of India. We're doing great work. Now I want to bring you up to date on the student status, the enrollment status. When the COVID hit, they shut the school down for about 6 months. There were about 6 students who could not go home. They couldn't get out of India. They couldn't go into their own mother country because they wouldn't allow travel across the border. So they stayed in Kakinada. They housed them in the school. They continued to teach them. The 6 teachers that we have in the school continued to conduct classes, not just for the students, but for members as well. And then after the COVID restrictions were lifted, that's when the impact of the restrictions of sending money into the school, to the bank in the school, became effective. And so the school was operating on minimum funds. And so the school had a limited capacity. We ran about 20 students in the school for about 2 years. And then as the doors began to open up and I could get funds into Nehemiah, backlog funds, he started bringing more funds, more students back to school. I received an email from him yesterday. He said they're now beginning their classes, their summer classes, in full capacity. They have 66 students who have enrolled. So we're praying that the funds will continue to flow. We'll be able to keep the school open. These are pictures that I've shown you from time to time, just to give you an idea of the complex. We have dorm rooms for the students. That we still have students who speak 3 different languages. Let me start over on that. The students don't speak 3 languages. The teachers speak different languages because we have different languages enrolled in the school. So we have those students that speak Telugu, some that speak Hindi, and some that speak English, and then once in a while we'll get one that speaks a little bit different language. But basically there are 3 languages. This is a picture of the student body. Last time that I was in India, which was 6 years ago. This is a more up-to-date picture from 2020. And you can see that it was about this time that the COVID hit, and all those students began their journey home. This is a picture of the staff. I know every one of these men. They're all still active. Some of these men speak Hindi, some of these speak Telugu, some speak English, and so they divide the student body up into different classes. Brother Scott, I want to try to give you an idea of the load on these guys. Try to imagine, if you will, Brown Trail School of Preaching with 20 students, all right? I want you to try to imagine this. And you've got one teacher to teach all the classes. That's about what it boils down to here. You have 6 men, other than Brother Goodham, that teach all the classes for 3 different languages. So you divide the men, 2 men per class. So you begin to see the load these men are carrying. In addition to that, these men actually preach and teach in various congregations. Some 2 congregations, some 3, and very involved in evangelistic efforts. You're not involved in our orphan work, but I want to tell you about some great things that are happening with orphans. We managed to stay the course in the care for our orphans because of the way we sent the money in. We sent it to Nehemiah Goodham's private account, and I put on the designated line in the wire transfers that were going to India that this is for benevolence. I didn't say what kind of benevolence, I just said benevolence. And so we used those funds to help care for these orphans. It was never interrupted. We have one home in Chukapali. They now have 9 orphans, and the house parents, Brother Jaya is a preacher. He and his wife have lived in that village from the time they were small children. They have 3 biological children of their own, and you can see the picture there. We built them a new facility about 5-6 years ago. I've not seen this in person, not been able to go, but we ended up with a beautiful complex. The children live upstairs. The church meets downstairs in the large assembly room, and the family has 2 rooms in the back of the building where they live. And so they wanted me to come to India. They begged me to come to India, and I just could not do it when they finished this. And so they took a beautiful picture of a banner they had made and said they love us, they miss us, and they want me to come back, and I want to go back. I applied for a visa to go into India this coming September. In fact, I'd already purchased the passage on Delta Airlines to fly into India with the contingency that if I couldn't get my visa, that I could get a refund on the airline tickets. And unfortunately, they rejected my visa. I've been on their blacklist for quite some time. Last time I went into India about 6 years ago, they grilled me at the customs for about half an hour. And I just did not think they were going to let me in. So they've sort of fine-tuned the way they let you apply for visas. Now, we used to could apply for a tourist visa with permission to visit various churches, and they would generally grant that. But now they won't grant that. If you go in as a tourist now, you have to provide the hotels where you're staying, the sites that you're going to see, when you're going to be there, and you show your tickets for hotel reservations. And of course, I can't do that. It's not in my itinerary to do that. So they rejected my visa. But I'm praying. I think eventually God will give us the opportunity to go back to India. Here's an orphan home in Goody Goodham. I've told you this one. We're in the process of building this orphan home here. It's almost finished. The last word I got that we have to do the plaster, put the doors and the windows on. And so far, I've not seen any funds to this project. The brethren have done this themselves, but they're completely out of money. And I think eventually they'll get this finished. But we stand ready to help them if possible, particularly if they increase the number of orphans in this home. We have 4 right now, and hopefully there'll be some more that'll add to that. We have another orphan home that I don't have any pictures of. It was established last year. There are 2 or 3 orphans in that home. So we now have 3 orphan homes with a total of 10, 14, about 18 children. And we could double that. You know, if we have the capacity financially, we could double that easily. You just go out to the street, you find a child, and you bring him into the orphan home. I've told you about the preaching in India. This is the result. This is the fruit of the Kakinada School of Preaching. We have hundreds of preachers scattered throughout the land. And I've had the opportunity to visit many of these. All of my work has been basically in 3 states. One of these was in Telugu down toward Chennai. Another was over in the area of Bangalore, which is on the western coast. I did some work there about 7 years ago. But most of my work is in Andhra Pradesh with these men that you see here. Small congregations, larger congregations. This is an interesting story in this congregation right here. It's in the big city of Guntur. Guntur has a population of maybe 7 million people, 6 million. That's small compared to some cities in India. And the preacher who labored in that city has been there for about 20 years now. And he went there after he graduated from Kakinada School of Preaching and revived an old work that was started in the 60s and just never took hold. Now there are 5 congregations in Guntur. There are about 30 villages around Guntur that have congregations, and he labors with them. He owns the land where this church building now stands, and he gave that land. Every Indian in his inheritance gets a parcel of land from his family and from whatever village he's a part of, and he donated this to the church. And they began building the church, but they couldn't finish it, and so we decided we'd help them finish the building. And about the time they finished this complex right here, the city of Guntur built a bypass around the city. It's what we would call an international, an interstate highway bypass, a loop around the city. Came within 2 blocks of this building. And you can't see the north side of this, but there's a huge wall, and they put a sign up there, the Church of Christ meets here. You can see it from their interstate. And God in His providence gave us the opportunity to advertise the Lord's church in that large city. We continue to get reports of brethren working, even in my absence. Brethren, these preachers, they don't just labor when I'm there. They're laboring constantly. And every week, I get emails from Nehemiah with pictures attached of people being baptized. 5, 10, 15, 20 every week. They continue to grow as these preachers labor with them. I have to tell you about Brother Prabhudas. Brother Prabhudas was a middle-aged man, had 2 teenage boys. He started the church here in Palico, and he built this church up. It's a sort of a medium, middle-end class group of people in this village. And so they could afford a fairly nice building, had some high-caste Hindus that were converted, and they have a congregation of about 90. You see them here meeting during the COVID. They would take the congregation and they would divide it into 10 groups of 10 or 12 and meet, and then the next group would come and meet, and he would stay and preach every sermon. Scott, how would you like to preach 5 sermons at one congregation on a Sunday morning? 5 hours, then get on your bicycle, ride to another congregation, do the same thing, preach 2 or 3 times, then go to your third congregation and preach 3 or 4 times. He was preaching 10 to 12 sermons a day on Sundays. Brother Prabhudas came down with came down with Palico. That's the city. Came down with COVID. I introduced a new disease to you. Came down with COVID. And he went to a larger city to get help. And they gave him the medicine. He was doing much better. Went back for a checkup, and on his way back, he was killed in an automobile accident, leaving his wife and his boys, who are now in their early 20s, leaving his wife widowed. And this happened this past spring. So the church there has been devastated. It's had some effect upon the attendance. We're training one of his boys now to step into his shoes. But the work that Brother Prabhudas did was incredible. He's a wonderful product of the Kakinada School of Preaching. These are pictures of baptisms in different areas. I can tell you so many stories, even though I haven't been there. I continue to get pictures like this of the congregations meeting and people preaching, and this is because of the work of the Kakinada School of Preaching. And I'm firmly committed to doing what I can to keep the doors open on this school. I hope to be able to go back in the near future and to encourage the brethren and check up on the work at the school. But I'm confident that in my absence of being able to get boots on the ground, so to speak, that Brother Goodham is doing a great job. Brother Goodham is on the field. He goes to these villages Now, Brother Goodham is 82 years of age, and he still goes regularly up and down the eastern seaboard, preaching and teaching and encouraging brethren. And there are so many stories behind every one of these that I wish I just had the time to fill you in. I want to tell you a little bit more about some of my other mission efforts and exactly what's happened. I'm doing some work in Querétaro, Mexico. It's a city located in south central Mexico. It's an old city, very clean, very safe, very well organized. It's just an incredibly beautiful city. The people are very receptive to the gospel in Querétaro. I went down there last November and I participated in a lectureship. And Brother Freddie Garcia, who is a graduate from Brown Trail, I don't know if you know him or not, Freddie Garcia, and several brethren in that area, graduates from Brown Trail. The man on the right is Freddie Garcia, and man on the left is Janier Montialto. He lives in Costa Rica. And Janier contacted me a couple of years ago and asked me if I would come to Mexico, to Querétaro, and participate in the lectureship. And so I did last November. And we met with about 5 of the preachers there, and we talked about reviving the school of preaching that was in Querétaro. So we're now making plans to try to start school in Querétaro. I'm going back this coming November. My sweet wife, I remarried, by the way, April the 15th. You know, my first wife passed away about 4 years ago, and I remarried April the 15th to April Meacham. And she was one of the Bible class teacher workshop ladies that goes to these different lectureships. And she and Tia McWhorter do a great job in the Bible class workshops. And so she and I were married April the 15th. She's going with me to Mexico and other occasions. But anyway, we're going back to the lectureship this November. And then I'm going back to Querétaro, Mexico to engage in a campaign sometime in December. And then I'm headed over to Costa Rica as well. But these are some brethren in Querétaro. It's a great little congregation. This is Brother Kevin Rhodes. Some of you may recognize him. By the way, this is an authentic Mexican restaurant. This is not Tex-Mex. This is authentic Mexican restaurant. I go to eat Mexican food, and they say on the door, authentic Mexican food. That's not authentic Mexican food. This is. And there's a different taste to it, by the way. So that's the work in Querétaro, Mexico. And then this coming February, I'm finalizing the plans to go back to the Philippines this February to Quezon City. And Brother Jan J.A.N.E. and John Derek Diamante was a graduate of MSOP from the early 2000s. I've been over there one time. I plan to go back. This is a picture of the congregation when I was there in 2014. And they were meeting in a room off of his house. And I want you to, they would pull the chairs out, we'd have classes, and then we'd have the worship service. And this is what they have now built. They're in the final stages of putting this together. I don't know if this is connected to the house, but the reason I'm showing you this is I want you to look at the difference in the size of the room here and in the size of the room here. That's how much this congregation has grown in Quezon City. So I'm anxious to go back to the Philippines and help. Let me give you some of the present plans I have. I told you I've been teaching at the Memphis School of Preaching for 5 years. It's been a wonderful 5 years. I couldn't have thought of can't think of a better way to have spent 5 years in my life training men to preach the gospel. But because of time constraints, my mission work is quite limited at Memphis School of Preaching. So I resigned my work after April and I were married. I resigned my work with the intention of going back into full-time mission efforts to various parts of the world. And so I'm shifting my work back now to full-time missions. That's also going to give me the opportunity to do more fundraising, hopefully to come by and see y'all a little bit more often. I think I'm hitting an average about once every 3 or 4 years, and I apologize for that. But you know, there's just so many days in a year. To squeeze them out. So I'm shifting my work back to full-time missions, and I'm going to give some time to writing. I've now written 18 commentaries. I'm working on my 19th commentary. Hope to finish that this fall, and eventually, maybe if the Lord gives me the resources and the strength, I hope to complete an entire commentary on the whole New Testament within the next 10 years. And don't ask me if I'm going to do one on the Old Testament. I'll wait and let the Lord decide that. I have mission trips right now planned to the Philippines, Mexico, 2 trips to Mexico, 1 to Singapore next fall, then 1 to Costa Rica, and I've got 3 countries in Africa that I'm making arrangements to go to next summer of 2023. And so the doors are opening. We're looking for the resources to do this. And I appreciate so much what you send in helping us keep Kakinada School of Preaching open. If you're looking to expand your work in the near future, there are so many needs, so many great opportunities. Some of the needs that I constantly talk about: money to print Bibles and tracts, money for the Kakinada School of Preaching. With the COVID and our shutdown of the school for a while, we've had about a third of our support, dropped about a third of our support to Kakinada. So we only have about $4,000 a month that is committed to the school. And we need $7,000 a month to keep these doors open with 60 students capacity. We're looking for evangelistic efforts in Orissa. The door is open in the state of Orissa. I sent Nehemiah up to Orissa every June for the past 5 years in my absence. And he has gone into Orissa, and in these 5 years, I'll just boil it down to a few statistics that may seem unbelievable. But brethren, they're true. They've converted 80 denominational preachers and their congregations. They've acquired 60 of the church buildings. Now they have the label Church of Christ meets here. There have been more than 3,000 baptized in those 5 years. Not just when Nehemiah was there, but preachers working on the field. So Orissa is opening up. Nehemiah wants me to come spend an entire campaign in Orissa. So you see, there's a lot of work to be done. I'm looking for increased support for my personal support. Going back into full-time missions, my personal support has to be raised. April and I are trying to hit a goal of $4,500 a month. We now have $3,000 in place, so we're lacking about $1,500 a month for our personal support. So we're also looking for funds for travel, one-time contributions to purchase tickets, to deal with the field expenses when we're there. And these are things that are they're ongoing expenses. And I love congregations, and I love the Grayston congregation, because when you signed on, you didn't stay on for 2 or 3 months and then drop. I've had congregations do that. Well, we're going to stay with you. We're going to 2 months later, they say, well, we want to lay some new flower beds around the south side of our building, and the water bill is going to cost. Let the flowers burn up, brethren. There are souls to be saved. So you have your priorities right, and I'm so grateful for that. And I want to tell you about 2 congregations that are helping in our work, overseeing our work. The Forest Hill congregation, this is where all the funds for my mission work are sent. That's where you are sending your checks now. It's to Forest Hill. I don't take a penny of support out of that. I pay for my expenses out of that fund, my trips and so forth. That's just for the mission work. The Panama Street in Montgomery, Alabama is where we now have our membership. And they're funneling the fund, receiving and funneling the funds for our personal support. So if you want to help our personal support, you send funds to Panama Street. If you want to help us in our mission efforts, including Kakinada and orphan homes and things like that, you send it to Forest Hill congregation. Well, I thought I could get it in enough time. I want to very quickly, I'm going to leave this up here in case you want to copy this down, but I want to just give a very, very brief devotional and sort of turn our attention toward our lives as Christians. In Psalm chapter 1, the first 3 verses, here's what the psalmist writer wrote. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And in that law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree that's planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth its fruit in its season, and whatever he does, he shall prosper. There are several things that come out of those 3 verses that describe the godly man. And what I'm encouraging you to do as we get ready to extend the invitation is to look at yourself and ask yourself if you are a godly man or woman. There are 4 character traits. Number 1, the godly man is the man who's contented. Maybe that's a fruit of godliness. Contentment is something that is learned. Blessed is the man That Hebrew word, when the Septuagint translators translated the Hebrew into Greek, they used the word that our Lord used in Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. That's more than happiness based on circumstances. The majority of our world bases their happiness on things. If things are going well. If you doubt that, look at every election cycle. What is the predominant motivating factor? What am I getting out of this politician? What can he give me, materially speaking? And if the economy is good, they go with the prevailing party. If it's bad, they switch parties. They base their contentment on things. The Christian, the godly person, can be content in the total absence of things. I've seen that in India. People who live day to day, barely eking out a life. They're happy and contented because they're Christians. So I see that the person is contented within. Second of all, I see that the godly person is careful in his walk. He doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. He doesn't listen to the advice of the ungodly. He doesn't sit in the seat of the scornful. He doesn't stand and look in at the way of the sinner. He's a man who stands different. His walk is different.
Amen.
John expressed that in 1 John 1, verses 6 through 8. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another. Yes. And the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all unrighteousness. We're told in Colossians chapter 3 to walk in wisdom, to walk circumspectly toward those that are without. We're told in Ephesians to walk in love. The Christian life is a walk of a certain type of character trait. And the Christian is careful. The godly person is careful in his walk. He watches his spiritual steps. And he measures those steps based upon what God's Word says, not upon how he feels, not upon what the world says or the world thinks, but he bases those steps upon the Word of God. So he's contented within, he's careful in his walk. Number 3, he concentrates on God's Word. The second verse in that psalm, that first psalm says that he meditates on the law of the Lord. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and he meditates on it. That word meditate means to concentrate. You can read the Scriptures. You can then study the Scriptures, and you move one step closer to receiving a knowledge of the truth. You can read and study and never learn how to apply until you start meditating. If I were to ask you what percentage in our society reads the Bible today, you would be shocked at the small percentage. Less than 3% of our society reads the Bible every day. Now, out of those 3%, what percentage do you think studies the Bible? The percentage shrinks even more. And out of those who read and study, how many make application? It is a sad, sad percentage. And I know it's low for this reason. How can a nation that claims to be Christian in their basis approve of things like homosexuality and abortion and ungodliness the way they do? There's no application. The child of God delights in the law of the Lord. He's contented within, careful in his walk. He concentrates on God's Word, and he's complete in his work. He's like a tree that's planted. Every one of us here who have obeyed the gospel have been taken out of the world and planted into God's church. A changed location. And because we're planted in that new location, the psalmist writer said we prosper in the things that we do. Not materially, but we prosper spiritually. You see, there's great value in knowing that I'm a child of God and living according to his will. So we're going to ask you tonight, as you look at your life and you think about the vast opportunities that are ours throughout the world, it comes down to you as a Christian as well. Are you living a godly life? You have the opportunity tonight to obey the gospel. We extend his invitation every time that we meet. Hopefully we do, as members of the Lord's church, to invite people, as the bride and the Spirit do, to come and drink of the water of life freely. If you need to obey the gospel, would you do that tonight? If you need to ask for the prayers of the church, We extend his invitation to you as we stand, as we sing.
Come to Jesus.